So this isn't wood, and this puppet I made isn't wood either, but somehow I managed to convince a lot of people that it was wood, and today I'm going to show you how I did that. This is a very entry-level beginner tutorial on how to paint things to look like wood pretty realistically. What you need for this technique is your object. I'm going to use a sheet of paper because I don't actually need to paint anything, I just wanted to show you how it works. You need acrylic paint, ideally in a light eggshell beige color, in an orangey brown, and in a dark brown. You also need a semi-matte or matte varnish. You also need water, a container to mix your paint in, and that one old rough bristly brush that has been hanging around in your workshop for probably years that you should have thrown away a while ago, but you thought, hey, maybe I'll need this someday, and today is the day where you actually need it. And as an edit note, you never need to get any of the brands I have here. These brands are fine, they are not great, they're fine. And if you want to get this brand of varnish or this brand of acrylic paint, there is a link in the description. But generally, this works with any varnish, with any paint, and also with any kind of water. First up, you have to maybe prime your object. So if your object is very smooth and shiny like this plastic container, then I'd recommend that you give it a short and quick sanding. And if your object is very, very dark, I'd recommend that you either put on a layer of gesso or a layer of spray paint, whatever works for you. Just make it not be black anymore. After that, we're going to go in with our base color, and I'm going to show you two variations, and you can of course go for either of those or a mix in between. So I'm going to be painting a very dark wood today and a very light wood. So for the dark side, I'm priming my surface in this orangey brown base color. Now you can see me applying the paint very specifically. So for the direction of the wood, I picked up and down. So I'm only moving my brush up and down, and I'm making sure that the last layer of paint has stripes that definitely go in the right direction. You can do this using spray paint, airbrush, you can use a sponge to apply your paint. If you want it to be perfectly smooth, that's fine. I personally like having the added haptics of having this wood structure that we can actually feel. By the way, I also primed the lighter side of my paper, even though the paint and the paper have exactly the same color, for the reason that I wanted these stripes. This needs to dry now, so we can take our time and make our wash. A wash is usually a very watered down paint that is applied in thin layers in order to slightly alter the appearance of a piece. So for this I need two different washes for my two different wood tones. One is going to be a light brown and one is going to be a very dark brown. For the light one, I used this wash that I had left over from my Mortimer Puppet. I didn't want to waste materials. And for the dark brown, I actually decided that I wanted it to be darker than the paint I already had, so I mixed in a bit of black. To this, we're going to add water and varnish. I'd say it's about 70% water, 20% varnish, 10% paint, but don't stress about these numbers. You don't have to measure it, you just want a very watery consistency. The amounts you need depend on the paint and the varnish you have. You have to get a bit of a feel for this, but I would say it's not hard to do that. Also, if you want to mix your paints as well, instead of just using the paint straight from the container, make sure to mix before you add the varnish, because the varnish is white when it's wet and clear if it's dry. So the paint is going to look drastically different depending on whether it's wet or whether it's dried. Also, if you're really good about it, you would make a drying test where you smear a bit of your paint onto a scrap piece of paper, make it dry with a blow dryer, and that way you can see what your paint will look like in the end. That's always recommended, but for this wood technique I wouldn't stress about it. Now with our primed surface dry and our wash mixed, we can start getting out our fancy crusty old brushes. Just dip your brush into the wash and then press it against the edge of your container to get rid of some of the moisture. You don't want it to be too wet and you don't want it to be too dry. I think this is the hardest part about this technique, just trying to get the amount of moisture in the brush right, and it's not really hard at all. You then have to start applying the paint in the direction of the wood grain. Again, for me this is going from top to bottom in finished full strokes without ever stopping in the middle. And I'm just going to put on a few stripes. I'm not going to paint the entire area in a full layer. Since we have a bit of time while we're waiting for me to finish this stripiness, let me kindly ask you to leave me a comment if you find this tutorial helpful. Maybe tell me what other kinds of things you'd like me to teach you. Thank you! I'm going to leave it at this. I know this looks like ass right now. This is the point where you have to trust me, and we have to trust the process. With the first layer dry, I'm going to add a second layer, doing the exact same thing, putting the paint on strictly and not in a full layer, going with the direction of the wood. Remember, finished strokes. Now we're going to let that dry real quick, and on to the third layer, and this is essentially all we'll be doing until we're satisfied. I always feel like for a lighter wood that has less dimension and that's also more cartoony, fewer layers are better, and if you want a more realistic, more dimensional look, then you need more layers. So for this one I actually stopped doing layers on the lighter side after I believe 3 or 4, and for the darker side I just kept going until I was really satisfied with it. And of course you can alter this as much as you like. Just keep in mind that the more layers you do, the more opaque your wash is going to end up being, the darker your wood is going to be, and the less structure you're going to see in the end. If you overdo it, you're going to have your object just be brown, but it's really hard to overdo it. Now, a few things that are great about this technique are that the stakes are really low. You're going to do a lot of layers, so even if one layer comes out slightly wonky, let's say you put on too much paint and it's just one opaque layer, that's not a big deal because your wash isn't opaque anyways, but also it's easy to adjust. So I figured out somewhere along the way that I wanted the wash for my dark side to be number 1 more opaque and number 2 darker. So I just adjusted that real quick and there was no damage done. So this is what my piece looked like in the end. I think this took me about 30 minutes to do. Of course, it would have been more efficient if I hadn't blow dried it and instead just done something else during the drying times. Also, you can get creative with this technique. I have this apple that I made a while back, and you can see especially on the red side that I used the exact same technique. So for this one I just mixed up a green and a red and a yellow of these washes, and I just went layer after layer after layer, and I gave it that really cool, somewhat realistic look. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, if you found it helpful, please subscribe. And if you use this technique on any of your pieces, whatever that may be, props, puppets, costumes, please let me know. Tag me on Instagram or something and I'll happily share it and leave you a comment and gush about how good you did. Please kindly give me another 30 seconds of your time. So Valentine's Day is quickly approaching. I know we're all depressed, single and playing Dungeons and Dragons, and therefore I got for you these healing potions. They are my newest and kind of first product design, and they glitter if you shake them. So if you're even a bit interested, please check out the links in my description. Thank you very much.